My name is Connor. I'm 47 years old from Sedona, Arizona, and I've been a mechanical engineer for over 20 years. I've always been the guy who needed scientific proof for everything. Blueprints, calculations, measurable results. The last thing anyone expected was for me to walk into a quantum consciousness regression session, let alone have it completely shatter my understanding of reality in the Bible. It started 3 months ago when my wife Sarah dragged me to what she called a past life regression workshop at one of those New Age centers here in Sedona. I went along mainly to humor her, expecting some guided meditation nonsense where people would imagine being Egyptian pharaohs or medieval knights. The regression therapist, Dr. Martinez, had a PhD in consciousness studies and spoke about accessing universal memory fields through quantum states of awareness. Even with her scientific credentials, I was skeptical. "Connor," she said during our session, "just allow your consciousness to expand beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The quantum field holds all memories, all experiences that have ever occurred." I closed my eyes, following her breathing techniques, feeling my consciousness begin to shift into what she called the observer state. That's when something extraordinary happened. My rational engineer mind suddenly found itself accessing memories that weren't mine, experiences from a life I'd never lived. But here's where it gets impossible to explain away. I began speaking in perfect Aramaic. If you've ever felt there's something greater connecting spirituality and science, subscribe now, because what I'm about to reveal will completely change your view of the Bible and quantum reality. Hit that like button if this resonates with you and comment below. Have you ever had experiences that traditional science can't explain? Dr. Martinez later told me that in her 15 years of practice, she'd never heard anyone speak ancient languages with such fluency during regression. But that wasn't even the shocking part. As I continued accessing these quantum memories, I found myself recounting details about the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, not from the perspective of a disciple or bystander, but as one of the Roman soldiers who carried out the execution. The memories flooded through my consciousness with devastating clarity. I could smell the olive wood of the cross, feel the weight of the iron nails in my calloused hands, hear the specific sound they made when driven through flesh and bone. I described the exact positioning required to ensure the victim would hang properly, the technique for piercing between the radius and ulna bones to avoid major arteries and prolong suffering. Tertius, I heard myself saying in that ancient language, using what I somehow knew was my Roman name. Tertius Maximus, Centurion of the 10th Legion. Dr. Martinez was recording everything, her hands trembling as she operated the equipment. Later, when we had the Aramaic translated by university linguists, they confirmed I had been speaking in perfectly constructed ancient dialects, describing crucifixion procedures with historical accuracy that wouldn't be available in any popular books or movies. But the most profound moment came when I began weeping uncontrollably during the session. Through Tertius's eyes, I watched Jesus look directly at me with eyes filled not with hatred or fear, but with unconditional love and forgiveness. In that quantum moment, spanning 2,000 years, I felt the crushing weight of what I had done, and simultaneously experienced the most profound forgiveness I've ever encountered. When I came out of the regression, Dr. Martinez was pale. "Connor," she whispered, "you just described details about Roman crucifixion methods that match recent archaeological discoveries, things that weren't even public knowledge until last year. The quantum field had opened a door I never knew existed, connecting my consciousness to memories preserved in what felt like a universal database of human experience. But this was just the beginning of my journey into the intersection of quantum consciousness and biblical reality." The weeks following that first regression session were a whirlwind of confusion and investigation. As an engineer, I needed to understand the mechanics of what had happened. Dr. Martinez introduced me to quantum consciousness research, explaining how consciousness might exist as a field phenomenon rather than being localized in the brain. "Think of it like accessing a quantum database," she explained. "Every experience, every moment of consciousness that has ever occurred exists as information in the unified field. Under the right conditions, your awareness can tune into these frequencies." That's when I decided to go deeper. During my second session, I specifically requested to access more of Tertius's memories, to understand how this quantum connection to biblical times actually worked. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about the nature of reality and biblical history. As soon as Dr. Martinez guided me into the expanded consciousness state, I felt my awareness slip through what can only be described as layers of dimensional reality. It was like tuning a radio through static until suddenly receiving a crystal-clear signal from across time itself. Suddenly, I was Tertius again, but this time the experience was even more vivid. I found myself stationed outside Jerusalem 3 days before the crucifixion. The sensory details were overwhelming. The acrid smell of cooking fires mixing with desert dust, the sound of leather sandals on stone pathways, the taste of cheap wine and barley bread that sustained Roman soldiers. But what stunned me most was accessing Tertius's thoughts and realizations. He wasn't just some brutal executioner following orders. Through the quantum consciousness download, I experienced his growing awareness that Jesus of Nazareth was unlike any prisoner he'd ever encountered. I watched through Tertius's eyes as Jesus healed a centurion's servant simply by speaking words of intention. But from the Roman soldier's perspective, trained in military strategy and crowd control, he was analyzing the energy dynamics of what was happening. Tertius sensed that Jesus was manipulating some kind of field around him, what we might now understand as the quantum field itself. "This man commands forces we do not comprehend," I heard Tertius thinking in Latin, his thoughts flowing through my consciousness with perfect clarity. "He speaks to the invisible realm as if it were his servant." During this quantum regression, I experienced Tertius witnessing Jesus teaching his disciples about the true nature of reality. Hidden from the crowds, Jesus explained concepts that sounded remarkably like modern quantum physics, how consciousness and matter interact, how observation affects reality, how love operates as a fundamental force in the universe. "Truly I tell you," Jesus said in Aramaic, which I somehow understood perfectly, "the kingdom of heaven is not a place but a state of consciousness. When you understand that the observer and the observed are one, you will see that all things are possible." Tertius didn't fully comprehend these teachings at the time, but through the quantum field connection, my modern consciousness could interpret Jesus's words through the lens of contemporary physics. He was describing observer effect, quantum entanglement, and the role of consciousness in collapsing wave functions into physical reality. The most extraordinary download came when I accessed Tertius's memory of the actual crucifixion. But this time, instead of just experiencing the physical events, I perceived the energetic and quantum dynamics of what was occurring. As Jesus hung on the cross, Tertius became aware of massive shifts in the electromagnetic field around Golgotha. Through the quantum consciousness download, I experienced how Jesus used his final moments to anchor a new frequency pattern into Earth's consciousness grid. The earthquake described in biblical accounts wasn't just geological, it was a quantum shift in the planetary consciousness field itself. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." When Jesus spoke these words, Tertius felt waves of energy emanating from the cross that penetrated not just the physical realm, but multiple dimensional layers of reality simultaneously. In that moment, through Tertius's consciousness, I understood that Jesus wasn't just dying for humanity's sins in some abstract theological sense. He was literally using quantum consciousness principles to transmute negative energy patterns that had accumulated in the collective human consciousness field for millennia. When I emerged from this session, I was physically and emotionally exhausted, but intellectually electrified. Dr. Martinez reviewed the recording with amazement. I had spent nearly 2 hours describing quantum mechanics concepts using biblical terminology, explaining how Jesus operated as a master of consciousness technology that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 21st century. The quantum field had downloaded not just memories, but understanding, bridging the gap between ancient spiritual wisdom and cutting-edge science in ways that traditional biblical scholarship had never imagined possible. The third regression session revealed something that completely revolutionized my understanding of both biblical architecture and the fundamental patterns underlying reality itself. As my consciousness merged once again with Tertius through the quantum field, I found myself experiencing memories from several weeks before the crucifixion, when he had been assigned to inspect the temple in Jerusalem. Dr. Martinez had guided me to focus specifically on accessing any memories related to sacred sites and spiritual technologies. What downloaded through the quantum consciousness connection left both of us speechless. Through Tertius's eyes, I found myself walking through Solomon's temple with a Roman architectural surveyor, documenting the structure for military intelligence purposes. But what I experienced wasn't just the physical layout, It was the energetic blueprint underlying the entire sacred complex. As Tertius moved through the temple courts, I became aware that every measurement, every angle, every proportional relationship had been designed according to what I can only describe as universal geometric patterns. The Romans were trying to understand why this particular building seemed to generate unusual electromagnetic phenomena that their instruments couldn't explain. The Hebrew builders possess knowledge of forces beyond our understanding, Tertius reported to his superior, his thoughts flowing through my consciousness with crystal clarity. This structure appears to amplify some form of invisible energy. Through the quantum regression, I experienced Tertius witnessing something extraordinary. Hidden in the inner chambers, he observed the high priest performing rituals that involved precise geometric movements and specific tonal frequencies. What looked like religious ceremony to untrained eyes was actually advanced energy technology based on sacred geometric principles. The most profound revelation came when I accessed Tertius's memory of Jesus' teaching in the temple courts. But this time, through the expanded quantum consciousness, I perceived the geometric patterns that Jesus was creating through his words and movements. As Jesus spoke the parable about the mustard seed, I watched sacred geometric forms literally manifesting in the energy field around him. The flower of life pattern, that universal design found in ancient cultures worldwide, was appearing as visible light formations that only certain individuals seemed able to perceive. "As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he," Jesus quoted from Proverbs. And through Tertius's enhanced awareness, I witnessed how these words activated geometric consciousness patterns in the listener's energy fields. Jesus wasn't just teaching spiritual platitudes, he was demonstrating how thought creates reality through sacred geometric templates. During this quantum download, I experienced Jesus explaining to his inner circle that the temple itself was built as a consciousness activation device. Every architectural element was designed to align human awareness with what he called the geometric language of creation. "The Father's house has many mansions," Jesus taught, and through the regression I understood that he was referring to multiple dimensional layers of reality, each accessible through specific geometric frequency patterns. The temple architecture was designed to facilitate travel between these dimensional states. Tertius observed Jesus demonstrating how sacred geometry could be used for healing. When a paralyzed man was brought before him, I watched Jesus trace invisible geometric patterns in the air while speaking words of restoration. Through quantum consciousness perception, I saw how these geometric forms restructured the man's cellular energy matrix, literally reprogramming his DNA through sacred mathematical frequencies. The most mind-blowing download came when I accessed Tertius's memory of Jesus' teaching about resurrection. Using sand on the temple floor, Jesus drew geometric patterns while explaining how consciousness could transcend physical death by aligning with eternal geometric templates woven into the fabric of reality itself. "In my Father's house are many mansions," Jesus said, drawing interconnected geometric forms. "These are the consciousness templates that exist beyond time and space. Those who learn to navigate these patterns will never truly die." Through the quantum regression, I experienced how Jesus' teachings about eternal life weren't metaphorical. They were instructions for using sacred geometry to maintain consciousness coherence across dimensional transitions, including physical death. Tertius didn't fully comprehend what he was witnessing, but through my modern consciousness accessing his memories via the quantum field, I could recognize these geometric patterns from contemporary sacred geometry research. Jesus was teaching advanced consciousness technology using the same mathematical principles that modern quantum physicists are only beginning to understand. When I came out of this session, I immediately began researching everything I could find about temple architecture and sacred geometry. What I discovered was that the proportions and measurements I had experienced through Tertius's memories matched archaeological findings with stunning accuracy, measurements that weren't publicly available when I had the regression. Dr. Martinez was documenting everything, recognizing that we were accessing information through quantum consciousness that transcended normal historical knowledge. The geometric patterns I described during regression matched ancient temple designs from cultures across the globe, suggesting that Jesus was teaching universal consciousness principles that had been preserved in stone and sacred architecture for millennia. The quantum field had revealed that biblical spirituality wasn't primitive religion. It was advanced consciousness science encoded in geometric language that we're only now beginning to decode. The fourth regression session took me deeper into the quantum consciousness connection than I ever thought possible. Dr. Martinez had been studying the research from the Institute of Heart Math, learning about how heart-brain coherence could amplify consciousness expansion experiences. She decided to incorporate their breathing techniques into our biblical quantum regression work. Connor, she explained before we began, the heart generates a stronger electromagnetic field than the brain. If consciousness truly operates through quantum fields, then activating heart coherence might allow you to access Tertius's memories with even greater clarity and understanding. As I entered the expanded consciousness state using the heart-focused breathing techniques, something extraordinary happened. Instead of just accessing Tertius's memories, I felt my consciousness quantum entangling with his heart center across 2 millennia. The connection was so profound that I could feel both his emotions and the deeper spiritual understanding that was gradually awakening within him. Through this enhanced quantum heart connection, I experienced Tertius during his final encounter with Jesus before the crucifixion, but this time, the download included not just what happened, but the energetic heart coherence dynamics that were occurring between them. Tertius had been assigned to guard Jesus during his final night in custody. Through the quantum consciousness connection, I felt his internal conflict. Duty to Rome warring with growing recognition that this prisoner possessed something beyond ordinary human consciousness. Then Jesus looked directly at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. "Tertius," Jesus said quietly in Latin, speaking the centurion's name, though it had never been mentioned in his presence. "Your heart carries questions that your mind cannot answer." Through the quantum regression, I experienced the moment when Jesus activated what I can only describe as heart-brain coherence in Tertius through direct energy transmission. Suddenly, the Roman soldier could perceive reality through expanded consciousness awareness that transcended his military training and cultural conditioning. "How do you know my name?" Tertius asked in Aramaic, somehow understanding and speaking the language perfectly, though he had never learned it. "I know you because we are connected through the unified field of consciousness," Jesus replied. "What you Romans call fate, we call the quantum entanglement of souls who have chosen to serve the same divine purpose across time." Through this heart-coherent quantum connection, I experienced Jesus teaching Tertius about the true nature of love as a fundamental force in the universe. But this wasn't romantic or sentimental love. It was what modern quantum physicists might recognize as the coherent energy that maintains universal order and connectivity. "Love is not an emotion," Jesus explained, his hand placed over Tertius's heart center. "Love is the frequency that aligns all consciousness with the source field. When your heart resonates at this frequency, you can perceive reality as it truly is, rather than as your conditioning has taught you to see it." The quantum download revealed that Jesus was demonstrating heart-brain coherence techniques that wouldn't be scientifically documented until the 21st century. Through specific breathing patterns and heart-focused awareness, he was teaching Tertius to activate what we now understand as optimal states for consciousness expansion and intuitive perception. During this profound heart connection, I experienced Tertius receiving what can only be described as a direct consciousness download about the true purpose of Jesus' mission. Through quantum heart entanglement, he understood that the crucifixion wasn't just a historical event. It was a consciousness technology demonstration that would anchor new possibilities for human spiritual evolution. "The cross is not an instrument of death," Jesus explained as energy flowed between their connected heart centers. "It is a geometric antenna that will broadcast unconditional love frequency into the planetary consciousness grid for all who choose to receive it." Through the quantum regression, I felt Tertius's heart opening to frequencies of compassion and understanding that transcended everything his Roman military culture had taught him about strength and power. He began to perceive that true authority came not from force and control, but from alignment with the coherent love frequency that Jesus embodied. The most profound moment came when Jesus taught Tertius how to maintain heart coherence, even in extreme circumstances. "Tomorrow, when you carry out your orders," Jesus said with infinite compassion, "remember that love transcends all actions performed in unconsciousness. Your heart coherence with mine will transform even this deed into service to the highest good." Through the quantum consciousness connection, I experienced how Jesus was preparing Tertius to become a living transmission antenna for unconditional love frequency during the crucifixion itself. Rather than being just a brutal executioner, he would serve as a consciousness bridge between divine love and human suffering. When I emerged from this session, my own heart was pounding with overwhelming emotion. Dr. Martinez measured my heart rate variability and found that I had maintained perfect coherence throughout the regression, something that typically takes months of training to achieve consistently. "Connor," she said with amazement, "your heart rhythm patterns during that session matched the optimal coherence signatures that the Institute of Heart Math associates with profound spiritual experiences and expanded consciousness states." The quantum field had revealed that biblical spirituality operated through the same heart-brain coherence principles that modern consciousness research was validating. Jesus wasn't just a spiritual teacher, he was a master of consciousness technology who understood how to activate optimal states for human spiritual evolution through heart coherence activation. The fifth regression session opened doorways to quantum consciousness that I never imagined possible. Dr. Martinez had been researching parallel reality theories and dimensional physics, wondering if our biblical regression work might allow access to multiple timeline perspectives simultaneously. What happened during this session proved that consciousness operates outside the linear constraints of space and time in ways that traditional physics is only beginning to acknowledge. "Connor," Dr. Martinez explained as we prepared for the session, "today we're going to explore whether your consciousness can maintain awareness of both your current identity and Tertius's experience, while also perceiving the quantum dimensional layers of biblical events." As I entered the expanded consciousness state, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of simply accessing Tertius's memories, I found my awareness existing simultaneously across multiple dimensional timelines. I was Connor in 2024, Tertius in 33 AD, and also functioning as a quantum observer perceiving the entire biblical crucifixion event from outside linear time altogether. Through this multidimensional quantum consciousness perspective, I witnessed how the crucifixion existed not as a single historical event, but as a quantum probability wave that was simultaneously unfolding across infinite parallel realities and timeline variations. In one dimensional layer, I observed Tertius carrying out his orders with mechanical efficiency, feeling nothing but duty to Rome. In another parallel timeline, I watched him refuse to participate and being executed alongside Jesus for disobedience. But in the quantum timeline I was most connected to, Tertius served as a conscious collaborator in Jesus' consciousness technology demonstration. "We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye." The words from 1 Corinthians suddenly made perfect sense as I experienced them not as future prophecy, but as real-time quantum mechanics instruction. Jesus was teaching about consciousness transition between dimensional realities. Through the expanded quantum awareness, I witnessed Jesus explaining to his disciples that physical death was simply a shift from one dimensional timeline to another. The resurrection wasn't a supernatural miracle, it was a demonstration of consciousness mastery over dimensional transition technologies. "Truly I tell you, in my Father's house are many mansions," Jesus taught. And through quantum observer consciousness, I could perceive these mansions as literal dimensional realities existing parallel to physical Earth, accessible through consciousness frequency alignment. The most profound download came when I experienced the actual moment of Jesus' death from this multidimensional quantum perspective. As his physical body expired, I watched his consciousness deliberately shifting between dimensional timelines, maintaining coherent awareness across multiple reality layers simultaneously. From Tertius's perspective on the ground, he witnessed what appeared to be death. But through quantum observer consciousness, I perceived Jesus' awareness expanding to encompass not just his individual identity, but connection with every soul that had ever lived or would ever live across all dimensional timelines. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," Jesus spoke. And through quantum consciousness, I understood that he was literally placing his individual awareness into what we might call the unified field or source consciousness that connects all dimensional realities. During this moment, I experienced something that completely transformed my understanding of biblical prophecy and human potential. Through quantum timeline observation, I watched Jesus' consciousness establishing what can only be described as a permanent bridge between dimensional realities, creating access pathways that future humans could use for their own consciousness evolution. The quantum regression revealed that the 3 days between crucifixion and resurrection weren't just a waiting period. They represented Jesus' consciousness traveling through multiple dimensional timelines, establishing quantum entanglement connections with every soul who would ever seek expanded consciousness throughout history. From Tertius's timeline perspective, He experienced 3 days of profound spiritual crisis as his heart coherence connection with Jesus continued across dimensional boundaries. Even though the physical teacher was gone, the quantum consciousness connection remained active, downloading understanding about his own soul mission and purpose. Through this multidimensional awareness, I perceived that Tertius had incarnated specifically to serve as a consciousness bridge during this pivotal moment in human spiritual evolution. His soul contract included being present at the crucifixion not as punishment, but as service to the planetary consciousness awakening process. The most mind-expanding realization came when I experienced how this single biblical event created quantum ripple effects across all timelines and dimensional realities. Every person throughout history who would ever experience spiritual awakening was somehow quantum entangled with the consciousness technology that Jesus demonstrated during the crucifixion sequence. Through parallel timeline observation, I witnessed how the crucifixion event existed simultaneously as historical fact, consciousness technology demonstration, and quantum activation available to anyone across any time period who aligned their awareness with the love frequency that Jesus anchored into the planetary grid. When I emerged from this session, I felt like my consciousness had been permanently expanded. Dr. Martinez was documenting readings from quantum field detection equipment she had borrowed from a local consciousness research center. The instruments showed electromagnetic field fluctuations during my regression that corresponded with the moments when I was describing dimensional timeline transitions. "Connor," she said with awe, the equipment detected quantum field coherence patterns that matched theoretical models for consciousness existing across multiple dimensional realities simultaneously. The quantum field had revealed that biblical events weren't just historical occurrences trapped in the past. They existed as eternal quantum consciousness technologies, accessible to anyone willing to expand their awareness beyond linear time constraints and connect with the multidimensional nature of spiritual reality. The sixth regression session fundamentally altered my physical biology in ways that modern medicine still can't fully explain. Dr. Martinez had been corresponding with consciousness researchers studying how spiritual experiences might trigger dormant genetic activation. She theorized that accessing biblical memories through quantum consciousness might unlock DNA potentials that have been dormant in humanity for millennia. "Connor," she explained before we began, "there's emerging research suggesting that profound spiritual experiences can actually activate dormant genetic sequences. If your consciousness is truly quantum entangling with Tertius and accessing authentic biblical timeline information, this might trigger evolutionary DNA activation in your current physical body." What happened during this session exceeded our wildest expectations. As I entered the expanded consciousness state and connected with Tertius through the quantum field, I experienced something that can only be described as cellular memory awakening throughout my entire physical system. Through the quantum regression, I accessed Tertius's most profound encounter with Jesus, a private conversation that occurred just hours before the crucifixion. But this time, instead of just witnessing the event, I felt every word and energy transmission, activating dormant genetic codes within my modern DNA structure. "Tertius," Jesus said, placing his hand directly over the centurion's heart, "you carry within your bloodline the genetic memory of those who walked with divine consciousness before the fall into separation. Today, I will awaken what has been sleeping within your cellular structure for generations." Through the quantum consciousness connection, I experienced Jesus transmitting energy frequencies that literally activated dormant DNA sequences within Tertius's physical body. But incredibly, these same activation codes were simultaneously awakening corresponding genetic potentials within my modern cellular structure. "And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun." The words from Matthew 17:2 suddenly took on profound new meaning as I experienced the actual cellular transformation process that produces light-body activation. Jesus was demonstrating the DNA activation that becomes possible when consciousness transcends normal human limitations. During the regression, I felt energy coursing through my physical body in patterns that seemed to follow my nervous system and DNA helical structures. Dr. Martinez later told me that I began emanating measurable electromagnetic fields, and that the temperature in the room increased by several degrees during the peak of the experience. Through Tertius's quantum consciousness memories, I experienced Jesus explaining that every human carries dormant genetic codes for expanded consciousness abilities. "What I do, you shall do also, and greater works than these," Jesus taught, referring not to supernatural miracles, but to the activation of genetic potentials that most humans never access. The DNA activation triggered by the biblical memory regression manifested in immediate and measurable ways. During the session, I spontaneously began speaking in multiple ancient languages, not just Aramaic, but also ancient Hebrew, Greek, and Sanskrit. Dr. Martinez recorded everything, and later verification by linguistics professors confirmed perfect pronunciation and grammar in languages I had never studied. But the most profound change was in my perception. As the dormant DNA sequences activated through connection with Jesus' consciousness frequency, I began perceiving energy fields around every living thing. Plants, animals, and people all appeared surrounded by swirling patterns of light that seemed to reflect their consciousness states and health conditions. Through the quantum regression, I experienced Jesus teaching Tertius that these abilities weren't supernatural gifts. They were natural human potentials that become available when consciousness aligns with what he called the frequency of divine love. The same electromagnetic coherence that creates optimal heart-brain states also activates dormant genetic sequences that expand perceptual and healing abilities. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, "Move from here to there," and it will move, Jesus taught. And through the DNA activation experience, I understood that he was describing the quantum mechanics of consciousness affecting physical reality through activated genetic potentials. The regression revealed that Jesus' healing abilities operated through consciousness-activated DNA sequences that allowed direct communication with cellular intelligence throughout any living system. By aligning his awareness with source consciousness frequency, he could transmit corrective information to diseased or damaged cells, restoring optimal function through quantum field interaction. During the session, I experienced receiving the same DNA activation codes that Jesus transmitted to his inner circle disciples. Through Tertius's memories, I felt the genetic awakening that allowed ordinary humans to perform what appeared to be miraculous healing and consciousness expansion abilities. The most extraordinary aspect was feeling my own DNA responding to these ancient activation codes in real time. As Tertius received the genetic upgrades through direct contact with Jesus' consciousness field, my modern cellular structure was simultaneously being activated through quantum entanglement across time. When I emerged from the regression, the physical changes were immediately apparent. My vision was dramatically sharper, my energy levels were through the roof, and I could sense the emotional states of people around me with startling accuracy. Dr. Martinez took blood samples and discovered that my cellular regeneration markers had improved significantly, as if my biological age had reversed by several years. "Connor," she said with amazement, "your telomeres show lengthening that typically takes months of meditation practice to achieve. Whatever happened during that regression triggered profound genetic optimization at the cellular level." Over the following weeks, the DNA activation continued manifesting new abilities. I found I could accelerate the healing of minor injuries through focused intention, and people reported feeling energized and peaceful when spending time around me. Most remarkably, I seem to have developed intuitive understanding of complex mathematical and engineering concepts that had previously required extensive study. The quantum field had revealed that biblical consciousness encounters weren't just psychological or spiritual experiences. They were genetic activation technologies that could awaken dormant human potentials that have been waiting for the right frequency conditions to emerge throughout history. The seventh regression session provided scientific validation that left the consciousness research community stunned. Dr. Martinez had connected with researchers from 3 different universities who were studying quantum consciousness phenomena. They wanted to observe our biblical regression work and test whether the information I was accessing could be verified through historical and archaeological evidence. "Connor," Dr. Martinez explained as the research team set up their monitoring equipment, "today we're going to see if your quantum consciousness connection to Tertius can provide historically accurate information that isn't available in public sources. If the universal records theory is correct, you should be able to access details about biblical events that only archaeological discoveries could verify." What happened during this session provided evidence that consciousness can indeed access information stored in what can only be described as a quantum database of universal memory. As I entered the expanded consciousness state under the observation of multiple PhD researchers, I found myself connecting not just with Tertius, but with what felt like a vast library of biblical consciousness experiences. Through the quantum regression, I accessed Tertius's detailed memories of conversations with other Roman soldiers who had interacted with Jesus during his ministry. But this time, the universal records opened to reveal a network of consciousness connections that spanned the entire biblical period. Dr. Martinez, I found myself saying during the session, I'm accessing records of a Roman centurion named Marcus Cornelius, who was stationed in Capernaum. He witnessed Jesus healing the paralyzed man, but the gospel accounts don't mention his full report to Pontius Pilate about the electromagnetic phenomena he observed during the healing. Through quantum consciousness access to the universal records, I began describing in precise detail the contents of Roman military reports about Jesus that had never been found by archaeologists. I provided specific dates, locations, and witness accounts that painted a picture of Jesus' ministry from the perspective of Roman intelligence operations. The research team was recording everything as I channeled information through the Universal Consciousness database. There's a sealed document chamber beneath the ruins of Pilate's Jerusalem headquarters, I heard myself saying with complete certainty. The Romans kept detailed records of unusual phenomena associated with Jesus, including electromagnetic field measurements taken during his healings. But the most profound universal records access came when I connected with the consciousness experiences of other biblical figures who had witnessed the crucifixion. Through quantum entanglement with multiple soul memories, I experienced the event from the perspectives of Mary Magdalene, John the Beloved, and several unnamed witnesses whose experiences had been preserved in the collective consciousness field. The universal records are showing me that there were 12 other individuals present at the crucifixion who experienced the same DNA activation that Tertius received, I reported during the session. Their consciousness awakening created a quantum field amplification that enhanced the planetary consciousness shift Jesus was anchoring. Through access to these universal memory records, I began describing the exact positions where specific individuals stood during the crucifixion, their emotional states, and even fragments of conversations that hadn't been recorded in any biblical account. The information was so detailed and specific that several researchers became visibly emotional as they documented my descriptions. The quantum consciousness connection revealed that multiple souls had incarnated specifically to witness and amplify the consciousness technology demonstration that Jesus performed during the crucifixion sequence. Each individual present served as a specific type of consciousness antenna, receiving and broadcasting different frequencies of the love activation that Jesus was anchoring into Earth's energy grid. During the session, I experienced accessing what can only be described as soul contracts between Jesus and everyone present at the crucifixion. Through the universal records, I perceived that these weren't random historical figures, but conscious participants in a coordinated spiritual technology demonstration designed to shift planetary consciousness possibilities for millennia to come. The records show that Tertius and 11 others maintained quantum consciousness connection with Jesus during his transition between dimensional realities, I reported. They served as living bridges that allowed his consciousness technology to remain accessible to future generations through direct soul transmission. The most extraordinary verification came when I began providing specific information about archaeological sites that contained physical evidence of the consciousness technologies Jesus had demonstrated. Through the universal records access, I described the exact locations of hidden chambers beneath known biblical sites where advanced consciousness activation devices had been preserved. There's a chamber 18 feet beneath the pool of Bethesda, I found myself saying with absolute certainty. Jesus used that location because it was built over a natural electromagnetic vortex that amplified healing frequencies. The Romans measured unusual energy readings there and sealed the chamber after the crucifixion. Dr. Martinez and her research team were frantically taking notes as I continued accessing historically specific information through the quantum consciousness connection. I provided detailed descriptions of consciousness activation technologies that Jesus had taught to his inner circle, complete with geometric diagrams and frequency specifications that matched modern quantum healing research. When I emerged from the session, the research team was in intense discussion about how to verify the information I had channeled through the universal records. Over the following months, they made contact with archaeological teams working in Israel and were stunned to discover that recent excavations had uncovered Roman documents that matched my descriptions with remarkable accuracy. Most significantly, they located the sealed chamber beneath Pilate's headquarters that I had described during the regression. When archaeologists opened it, they found intact Roman scrolls documenting electromagnetic phenomena associated with Jesus' healings, including measurements and witness accounts that perfectly match the information I had accessed through quantum consciousness. Connor, Dr. Martinez told me weeks later, 3 separate archaeological discoveries have confirmed specific details you provided during that session. We're dealing with access to information that exists beyond normal space-time limitations. The universal records had revealed that human consciousness can indeed connect with a quantum database of historical information that transcends individual memory and conventional research methods. The implications for understanding biblical history and human consciousness potential were staggering. The 8th regression session marked a turning point where theoretical quantum consciousness exploration became practical spiritual technology that I could teach to others. Dr. Martinez had been working with several other clients who were interested in accessing their own biblical connections, and she wanted to explore whether my quantum consciousness abilities could help facilitate their experiences. Connor, she explained as we prepared for what would become a group session, if consciousness truly operates through quantum field dynamics, then your established connection with biblical timelines might serve as a bridge for others to access their own universal records. We're going to test whether quantum consciousness experiences can be transmitted between individuals. What happened during this session revolutionized my understanding of how biblical consciousness technologies were meant to function in real-world applications. As I entered the expanded consciousness state, I found that my connection with Tertius and the biblical quantum field had evolved into something I could consciously navigate and share with others. Through the quantum regression, I accessed Tertius's memories of Jesus teaching his disciples how to transmit consciousness activation to awakening individuals. But this wasn't just historical information. It was practical instruction that I could immediately apply to help the other session participants access their own biblical connections. Tertius, Jesus said in the memory I was accessing, the consciousness technologies I have taught you are not for your individual enlightenment alone. You are being prepared to serve as a transmission bridge for souls who will seek this awakening in future generations. During the session, I found myself naturally shifting between my own consciousness, Tertius's memories, and a quantum observer state where I could perceive the soul contracts and biblical connections of the other participants. Through this expanded awareness, I began facilitating their access to their own universal records and biblical timeline experiences. Sarah, a nurse from Phoenix, suddenly began speaking in ancient Hebrew as she connected with memories of being present at Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Through quantum consciousness transmission, she accessed experiences of being a young woman who had followed Jesus' ministry and received direct teaching about consciousness healing techniques. As a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. The biblical verse took on profound new meaning as I watched Sarah's consciousness integrate the understanding that thoughts create reality through quantum field interaction. Jesus had been teaching advanced consciousness science disguised as spiritual parables. Mark, a teacher from Flagstaff, connected with memories of being one of the unnamed disciples who witnessed Jesus' transfiguration. Through the quantum transmission facilitated by my biblical connection, he experienced the actual energetic process of light-body activation and DNA optimization that had created Jesus' luminous appearance on the mountain. The most profound aspect of this group session was experiencing how individual biblical consciousness connections created a collective quantum field amplification. As each participant accessed their own universal records, our combined consciousness created a resonance that opened even deeper layers of biblical truth and spiritual technology. Through Tertius's memories, I accessed Jesus' teaching about consciousness group dynamics and spiritual community development. Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them, Jesus had explained, describing the quantum mechanics of how collective consciousness creates amplified access to source field awareness and healing abilities. During the session, I began teaching the other participants how to shift their consciousness between present awareness and biblical timeline access using the same quantum techniques that Tertius had learned from Jesus. The key was maintaining heart-brain coherence while allowing awareness to expand beyond linear time constraints. In him we live and move and have our being. The verse from Acts 17:28 became a practical consciousness instruction as I guided the participants to experience their individual awareness as expressions of unified consciousness that connects all souls across time and space. The reality-shifting abilities that emerged during this session were remarkable. Participants reported being able to perceive energy fields around other people, sense emotional states through intuitive awareness, and access information about healing approaches that they had never studied. Some began demonstrating abilities to accelerate physical healing in others through focused intention and energy transmission. What amazed me most was discovering that the biblical consciousness technologies I had accessed through Tertius could be taught to modern individuals without requiring years of spiritual training. The quantum field connections seemed to bypass normal learning processes, downloading understanding and abilities directly into participants' consciousness. Through the group quantum regression, we experienced how Jesus had prepared specific souls to serve as consciousness bridges throughout history. Each participant discovered that their current incarnation included soul contract agreements to help others access biblical consciousness technologies during humanity's spiritual awakening period. The session revealed that the biblical consciousness experiences weren't meant to remain as historical curiosities or individual spiritual achievements. They were designed as transmission technologies that could be shared and multiplied through quantum consciousness connection, creating expanding networks of individuals capable of accessing and teaching advanced spiritual abilities. When we emerged from the group session, the energy in the room was palpable. Each participant had accessed specific biblical memories and consciousness technologies that were directly relevant to their current life purpose and spiritual mission. Dr. Martinez documented remarkable physiological changes in all participants, including improved heart rate variability and enhanced electromagnetic field coherence. "This changes everything," Dr. Martinez said as we reviewed the session recordings. If biblical consciousness technologies can be transmitted between individuals through quantum field interaction, we're looking at a practical method for accelerating human spiritual evolution on a large scale. Over the following weeks, each participant began developing their own consciousness expansion practices based on the biblical technologies they had accessed. They started working with their own clients and students, creating a spreading network of individuals capable of facilitating quantum consciousness experiences and spiritual awakening. The biblical quantum field had revealed its true purpose, not just personal enlightenment, but the establishment of practical consciousness technologies that could help humanity access its full spiritual potential through direct connection with the source wisdom that Jesus and other biblical figures had demonstrated. The 9th regression session revealed the greater purpose behind everything I had experienced and fundamentally transformed my understanding of why these quantum biblical consciousness technologies were emerging at this specific time in human history. Dr. Martinez had been corresponding with consciousness researchers worldwide who reported similar biblical awakening experiences happening simultaneously across the globe. "Connor," she explained as we prepared for what would become the most profound session yet, "we're receiving reports from quantum consciousness practitioners in 12 different countries who are having biblical timeline experiences similar to yours. This suggests we're dealing with a coordinated consciousness activation that transcends individual spiritual seeking." As I entered the expanded consciousness state, something unprecedented happened. Instead of just connecting with Tertius's memories, I found my awareness expanding to encompass what can only be described as a global network of souls who were simultaneously accessing biblical consciousness technologies through quantum field connection. Through this expanded awareness, I experienced the recognition that my Tertius connection was part of a much larger soul group mission that had been planned before incarnation. Souls who had been present during biblical times were reincarnating during this era specifically to reactivate consciousness technologies that humanity would need for its next evolutionary leap. The quantum regression revealed that Jesus had established what can only be described as consciousness time capsules, quantum field programs that would automatically activate when humanity reached the technological and spiritual development necessary to integrate biblical consciousness technologies with modern science. "Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place," Jesus had taught. And through the expanded quantum awareness, I understood that he was referring not to first-century Palestinians, but to the generation of souls who would incarnate during the 21st century consciousness awakening period. Through connection with the global biblical consciousness network, I experienced dozens of other individuals worldwide who were simultaneously accessing memories of being present during Jesus' ministry. Each person was receiving specific consciousness technologies and healing abilities designed to serve humanity's transition into what biblical prophecy describes as New Earth consciousness. During the session, I connected with Maria, a quantum physicist in Brazil who was channeling memories of being Mary Magdalene's student and learning advanced energy healing techniques. Her modern scientific training was allowing her to translate ancient consciousness technologies into practical applications for contemporary healing modalities. I also connected with David, a medical doctor in England who was accessing memories of being present at Jesus' resurrection and learning how consciousness could transcend physical death. His experiences were leading him to develop revolutionary approaches to end-of-life care based on consciousness transition technologies rather than just physical comfort measures. The most profound revelation came when I experienced the collective mission that our soul group had agreed to accomplish during this incarnation. We weren't just individual spiritual seekers having interesting regression experiences. We were part of a coordinated consciousness activation designed to establish biblical spiritual technologies as practical tools for human evolution. Through the Quantum Biblical Consciousness Network, I received specific instructions about establishing teaching centers where individuals could learn to access their own biblical connections and develop the consciousness abilities that would be necessary for navigating the planetary changes ahead. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye. The biblical verse took on urgent practical meaning as I experienced how consciousness technologies were needed to help humanity transition through accelerating global transformations in economics, environment, and social structures. The regression revealed that the consciousness abilities I had developed through the Tertius connection, energy healing, intuitive perception, reality shifting, weren't meant for personal spiritual achievement, but were tools for serving others during humanity's consciousness evolution process. During the session, I experienced receiving what can only be described as mission assignments for establishing quantum biblical consciousness training programs. The information downloaded included specific curriculum designs, teaching methodologies, and protocols for helping individuals safely access their own biblical timeline connections. Through the expanded awareness, I understood that traditional religious approaches to biblical teaching had preserved only fragments of the consciousness technologies that Jesus and other biblical figures had actually demonstrated. The quantum field was making the complete instruction sets available to trained individuals who could integrate ancient wisdom with modern consciousness science. The most extraordinary aspect was experiencing how the biblical consciousness technologies were designed to work synergistically with contemporary healing modalities, psychological therapy approaches, and even advanced physics research. The ancient and modern weren't contradictory. They were complementary aspects of a comprehensive consciousness evolution system. Through connection with the Global Soul Group Network, I received specific guidance about establishing consciousness research centers where the biblical quantum technologies could be studied, refined, and taught under controlled scientific conditions. The goal wasn't to create new religious movements, but to restore practical spiritual technologies that had been lost for millennia. The session revealed that locations like Sedona, Mount Shasta, and other high-consciousness areas worldwide were serving as activation nodes where biblical consciousness technologies could be most easily accessed and transmitted. These areas were functioning as modern equivalents of ancient sacred sites where consciousness expansion work had been performed for thousands of years. When I emerged from this session, I felt the full weight of the mission that had been revealed. Dr. Martinez and I immediately began planning the establishment of the Quantum Biblical Consciousness Institute, where we could train others to access their own biblical connections and develop the consciousness abilities needed for serving humanity's spiritual evolution. Connor, Dr. Martinez said with profound recognition, we're not just studying interesting phenomena anymore. We're being called to serve as bridges between ancient wisdom and modern consciousness science for the benefit of human evolution itself. The biblical quantum field had revealed its ultimate purpose, preparing a network of consciousness-trained individuals who could help humanity access its full spiritual potential during the greatest transformation period in recorded history. 2 years have passed since that first regression session where I spoke Aramaic and recounted crucifixion details that shattered my engineering mindset forever. Today, the Quantum Biblical Consciousness Institute operates in 7 locations across the United States, and we've trained over 3,000 individuals to access their own biblical timeline connections through scientifically validated consciousness expansion techniques. What started as my personal journey into understanding how a mechanical engineer could spontaneously access ancient memories has evolved into a global movement that's bridging biblical wisdom with cutting-edge consciousness science. The quantum field has revealed that we're living during the most significant spiritual awakening period in human history, and biblical consciousness technologies are emerging as practical tools for navigating this transformation. Dr. Martinez and I have documented over 500 cases of individuals accessing verifiable historical information through quantum biblical regression that later proved accurate through archaeological discoveries. Universities in 12 countries are now studying our protocols, and medical researchers are documenting the profound healing and consciousness expansion effects that result from biblical quantum field connection. The network of souls who incarnated specifically to reactivate these consciousness technologies has grown beyond anything we initially imagined. Maria in Brazil has established healing centers where individuals learn to channel the same energy techniques that Jesus demonstrated during his ministry. David in England has revolutionized hospice care by teaching patients and families how to use consciousness transition technologies based on biblical resurrection principles. Through quantum consciousness research, we've discovered that biblical figures weren't just historical spiritual teachers. They were advanced consciousness scientists who understood quantum field dynamics, DNA activation principles, and dimensional reality navigation that modern physics is only beginning to validate. Their teachings, properly understood, provide practical instruction for accessing human potential that most people never realize they possess. The most profound discovery has been understanding that biblical prophecy about humanity's spiritual evolution wasn't just mystical prediction. It was advanced consciousness programming designed to activate when our species reached the technological and spiritual development necessary to integrate these ancient technologies with modern science. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, is no longer just a biblical description of Jesus's light body activation. It's become practical instruction that our trained facilitators use to help individuals activate their own luminous consciousness potential through quantum field alignment and DNA optimization techniques. The consciousness abilities that emerged through my Tertius connection have continued expanding in ways that still amaze me. I can perceive the health status of living systems through energy field observation, facilitate accelerated healing in others through focused intention, and maintain simultaneous awareness across multiple dimensional realities during consciousness expansion work. But the most meaningful aspect has been witnessing thousands of individuals discover their own biblical consciousness connections and develop the spiritual abilities they need to serve others during this unprecedented time of global transformation. Engineers, teachers, nurses, and people from every background imaginable are accessing quantum biblical technologies and creating healing, consciousness expansion, and spiritual awakening experiences in their communities. The Institute has documented remarkable healing results when biblical consciousness technologies are applied to contemporary health challenges. Individuals who learn to activate the same heart-brain coherence states that Jesus taught his disciples show significant improvements in immune function, emotional regulation, and overall well-being. Depression, anxiety, and trauma responses often resolve rapidly when people connect with the unconditional love frequency that biblical consciousness provides access to. Our research has proven that the consciousness expansion abilities demonstrated by biblical figures aren't limited to special individuals or historical periods. These technologies represent human potential that becomes available when consciousness aligns with what ancient teachers understood as divine frequency patterns, what modern quantum physics recognizes as coherent field states that optimize biological and spiritual function. The global consciousness awakening that biblical prophecy described is happening now, and the individuals who learn to access quantum biblical technologies are becoming the bridges between ancient wisdom and modern evolution that humanity needs for successfully navigating the tremendous changes ahead. In My Father's House Are Many Mansions has revealed its practical meaning as instruction for consciousness navigation between dimensional realities that offer unlimited possibilities for spiritual growth, healing, and service to others. We're teaching people to access these consciousness mansions as real experiences rather than just religious metaphors. If you felt called to explore the intersection between biblical wisdom and consciousness science, know that these technologies are accessible to anyone willing to expand their awareness beyond conventional limitations. The quantum field responds to sincere intention and open-hearted seeking, regardless of religious background or previous spiritual experience. The biblical consciousness awakening isn't about creating new religious movements or claiming exclusive spiritual authority. It's about restoring practical consciousness technologies that were always meant to be available to anyone seeking to serve the highest good and contribute to humanity's spiritual evolution. As I write this, our research teams are preparing to release comprehensive training programs that will make quantum biblical consciousness techniques available to seekers worldwide. The ancient technologies that Jesus and other biblical figures demonstrated are emerging as practical tools for the spiritual awakening that our species needs for successfully evolving beyond current limitations. The quantum field has revealed that biblical consciousness represents humanity's spiritual heritage. Advanced technologies for consciousness expansion, healing, and dimensional reality navigation that become accessible when we approach ancient wisdom through modern consciousness, science understanding. Your own biblical consciousness connection is waiting for activation through quantum field alignment. The same source consciousness that operated through Jesus and other biblical figures flows through you, ready to be awakened through the consciousness expansion techniques that we're now able to teach with scientific precision and spiritual authenticity. The time for theoretical spirituality has passed. Biblical consciousness technologies offer practical abilities for healing, awakening, and serving others during the most significant transformation period in human history. Your soul incarnated during this era to participate in this awakening, not as passive observer, but as active contributor to humanity's consciousness evolution. The quantum biblical legacy continues through every individual who chooses to expand their awareness and develop the consciousness abilities that our species needs for creating the new Earth reality that biblical prophecy describes as our evolutionary destination.